groupe de réflexion sur le Moyen-Orient. C'est pour moi un grand privilège de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la première session de notre programme pour cette saison. Yesterday, Prime Minister of Israel, along with the foreign ministers of United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, met in Washington to sign the normalization agreement at a ceremony that was held at the White House and hosted by the US President, Mr. Donald Trump. To unravel this agreement and also to get an overview of what is going on in the Near East, and especially in Israel, we have been lucky or honored to have former ambassador to Israel, His Excellency John Allen, who has been in the region in different capacities and also in other places as representative of Government of Canada, to give us a perspective from Ottawa and try to get a better feel for what is going on currently in Israel, and also with this agreement that has been signed yesterday. Before we start, I wanted also to take the opportunity to thank CIC for giving us the facility, this Zoom platform, to conduct this virtual event. And especially, I would like to thank our Director of Communication, Mr. Samuel Amois, who is helping us with the organization in terms of technical aspects of this event. And shortly after the overview that the ambassador will present, we will be focusing on the questions and trying to get some answers regarding the questions that we have received. We have received a number of questions. Ambassador John Allen is well known to everyone here, and he doesn't need further introduction. Suffice to say that he is a distinguished diplomat and academic, and is currently senior fellow at the University of Toronto, the Monk Center, and also Canadian International Council. So without any further delay, Mr. Ambassador, microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Hamid. Thank you, Samuel, because we know how important the technology is in this. Thanks to the Middle East Study Group. I enjoyed speaking to you now a couple of years ago about the two-state solution, and thanks to the CIC, which I hold in high regard. You asked me to talk a little bit about the situation in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza first, and then to move on to the so-called Abraham Accords and do a little bit of analysis before we jump into questions. And I think the questions are really the most important part of this. But just to start with Israel and the territories, we've got a situation where Bibi Netanyahu and his family got on a plane and flew to Washington to celebrate this. It is a historic agreement. And meanwhile, in Israel, the country is about to be the first to actually renew a full lockdown as a result of the COVID crisis. There are now upwards of 5,000 cases a day in Israel. And unfortunately, the situation has now spread to the West Bank and to Gaza. All of that region initially had been under lockdown, and the situation was under control, and it loosened up a bit too fast, and now they're in a crisis. There's also an economic crisis. There was a recession, as there is in most countries affected by COVID, but now going back into lockdown, the situation will be substantially worse. And you've got in Israel a situation of political paralysis. Bibi Netanyahu entered into a coalition agreement with Benny Gantz, who left his blue and white party to join this coalition. Ironically, he said, and I believe him, he said because he wanted to fight COVID and tackle the economic recession. Unfortunately, neither of those have been achieved, And at the same time, the opposition that was won a significant number of seats in the last election has now been broken, and it's not exactly clear what's going ahead. It is a coalition in name only. Bibi seems to be trying to find any way possible to break that coalition and perhaps move to elections, the fourth in 2 years, in order to probably divert attention in part from his upcoming trial on indictments for fraud and breach of trust. In the West Bank, we continue to have sclerotic leadership. Mahmoud Abbas is 84 years old. There hasn't been an election in 14 years. I'll come back to this, but the only positive aspect of this agreement for the Palestinians is the fact that Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah united in its opposition to the agreements, which some are critical about. So the situation in this part of the Middle East is not particularly positive at the time, and it was probably a good idea for Bibi to fly to Washington and to, in a sense, achieve this diplomatic coup. So what can we say about the agreements now? I think it really depends on where you sit to decide where you stand on the agreements. For Israel, this is a major positive agreement in terms of legitimacy that it gives to a country that has been seeking legitimacy from the Gulf states and from Arab countries since 1948. As you all know, it is the sort of the latest peace agreement. The last one was with Jordan. I think it's a little off to call it a peace agreement, since there was really no war or conflict between Bahrain and the UAE. Indeed, these agreements have been called breakthrough peace agreements, a harbinger of more to come, an arms deal, a betrayal of the Muslim world, and a stab in the back of the Palestinian people. So, as I said, it really depends on where you're coming from. So for Israel, it was positive in terms of legitimacy. It was positive in terms of bringing into the open, from under the radar screen, relations with countries, especially the UAE, which it has had for a number of years. It has been engaged in the exchange of technology, some arms, and intellectual property for quite a while, but it's been under the radar screen, as I said, and now it's out in the open. And of course, for Israel, they are hoping, as Donald Trump suggested, that more countries will come on board. It will allow for the sale of Israeli technology, cyber technology, drone technology, perhaps their anti-missile technology as well. And it opens up Israel to a lot of investment from the UAE and perhaps from other countries. For the UAE, it offers an ally in the UAE's conflict with Iran, an important ally who can provide it with the technology that would be helpful for it. And of course, it has allowed the UAE, it seems likely, to be able to purchase F-35s and other very sophisticated equipment from the United States. Now, those deals have to be approved, not approved by Congress, but they have to go through Congress. They have to be notified to Congress, and we'll see what happens in the election there and what happens both in Congress and the presidency. but this is potentially a game changer for the UAE in terms of the nature of the sophisticated equipment, stealth fighters, equipment that can detect and defend against anti-missiles and missiles. So it's a big bonus for the UAE in that regard. And it allows the UAE to separate itself from Saudi Arabia, frankly, because the Saudis, I think, are currently in Congress's bad books because of the Khashoggi affair and their activities in Libya and Yemen, and where the UAE has pulled out. And so it allows them to separate themselves and to be the good Gulf state in the eyes of Congress. And then finally, for the United States, it's positive. For Donald Trump, it takes his failed peace deal off the table and replaces it with the Abraham Accords. It's obviously, the timing was designed to help him in his election campaign. I don't think it will, and we can talk about that, but it'll shore up his support from the evangelicals, and it'll shore up his support from right-wing Jews in the United States, but I don't think it's going to have a major effect. Foreign policy rarely does in the United States. The icing on the cake is the sale of this equipment because it'll bring billions of dollars into the US Treasury. And of course, for Donald Trump, he's gotten a couple of Nobel Peace Prize nominations, and for him to do what Barack Obama did is utmost importance, I think. As far as the loser's concerned, and I'll stop after I talk about that, Iran is a loser because we now have the United States, Israel, the UAE, Bahrain lined up and armed and technologically armed against it at a time when their economy is in a shambles, when COVID is rampant, and when US sanctions are causing no end of difficulties for them. Turkey is a loser in this. They have been working with Iran in some cases. They are on opposite sides of the fence with the UAE and Yemen, and they are supporters, as you know, of Hamas and other radical Islamic elements, and so they are losers. Saudi Arabia is in a sense a loser because the UAE has differentiated itself from Saudi Arabia. The Arab Peace Initiative, which was a Saudi-led initiative, has essentially been thrown aside, and the UAE has left the quid pro quo of peace with the Palestinians before recognition aside, and also, as I said before, the Saudis continue to some extent to be in Congress's bad books. And finally, the Palestinians. The quid pro quo, as I said, was peace treaty with the Palestinians, and then based on the Saudi initiative or whatever could be negotiated, and then the Arab states and the Gulf Cooperation Council, others would be able to recognize Israel, give it full diplomatic relations, etc. The Palestinians were left out of the negotiations of the Trump deal. They were left out of these negotiations. And while the UAE and Bahrain suggested in their speeches at the White House that they would use these agreements to advocate on behalf of the Palestinians, I remain somewhat skeptical about that, especially while Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump lead their respective countries. So let me stop there and let me turn it over to Hamid and your questions, and let's hear what you're interested in.
Thank you for a very even-handed analysis of the situation, John. We have received a number of questions, and prior to the session, we had invited everyone to provide us with some written questions. And in that category, we have a number of questions. And as a respect to people who sent their questions in advance, I would like to start with those first, and then I will go to the questions that we are receiving from the audience. With that, I will start with the first question. And that is, during the signing of the Abraham Accord, there were suggestions that other countries will join. And some of the commentators later on mentioned that Oman, Morocco, Sudan are possibilities. Do you agree with any of these as a likely scenario?
Yes, I mean, it's hard to predict what is going to happen. Certainly Donald Trump suggested there would be as many as 6 other countries, but Morocco has an interest. Interestingly, the reasons these countries are joining, and in part the reasons the UAE joined, is not so much their relations with Israel, but their relations with the United States. So Morocco would like to see their claim to a sovereignty over the Western Sahara recognized by the states, and that would allegedly be the trade-off on that one. Recognize Israel, US recognizes Western Saharan sovereignty by the Moroccans. The Sudanese are desperate to get off the US terrorist list, and it's arguable that, again, the US might want to trade that off for them joining the team. And Oman, there have already been significant relations between Israel and Oman. The president of Israel visited Oman. There's ongoing trade, etc. So Oman is a likely joiner as well. Saudi Arabia is a different question. There are rumors that the king is less enthusiastic about joining on. As I mentioned, the Saudi initiative is still out there, and the Saudis have said publicly that they want to continue to advocate on behalf of the Palestinians, but it's not out of the question. And once again, it might well be what does the United States have to offer Saudi Arabia? It's less what Israel has to offer Saudi Arabia and more what the United States has to offer them.
Thank you. And that was the point that was raised by, in one of the questions, that what sort of concessions would Israel be prepared to make to secure the normalization with the Saudis, which I think you have addressed to some extent.
To some extent, yes, I have. You know, it was interesting that that Bibi Netanyahu did not mention the Palestinians once. The president did, the 2 foreign ministers did, but Bibi did not mention them. And I find it hard to believe that that Bibi is going to change his long-held position that a Palestinian state will not come to fruition under his leadership. So I don't think he's got much to offer the Saudis other than, you know, there's the technology exchange, et cetera, that the UAE will get from Israel in addition to the US. But I think it's more what the United States can offer them in return.
The other question is, you have, I think, partially answered this. Which is basically, again, about the fact that Palestinians were not invited to this event. And the question is, what are the implications for the Israeli and Palestinian peace in the medium and long term? You just referred to it briefly, but anything else you would like to add?
Well, yeah, I think in the short term, unlikely for this to move that ball forward in any sense. What I would hope that might eventually happen is that the joiners would indeed advocate on behalf of the Palestinians, but more importantly, that they would encourage the Palestinians to have an election, to work on a serious draft peace proposal that could be put before the Arabs, the Israelis, and the Americans, and to get ready for a time when there would be some reception for that. I think the Palestinians now have an obligation to prove that no is not always the answer, but I sympathize with them in this situation. They've had 10 or 11 years of a government that was not interested in peace. They had the Trump plan, which in every respect favored the Israelis. They've had recognition of Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. So there's and the move of the embassy. So there's been a whole series of activities that have not been in their favor. So it's hard for me to generate enthusiasm or optimism for their cause at this point.
But in that context, then some of the arguments that unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the reason for Al-Qaeda and other radical groups to recruit. So what will happen now? Does that hold?
Yeah, I'm not, you know, we've talked about this before, Hamid. There's always this kind of theory that I used to hear for years, that all of the ills of the Middle East are due to the failure of the Israelis and the Palestinians to come to an agreement. The problem with Israel and Palestine is a huge problem for those two countries. It's becoming an existential problem for Israel in terms of what kind of country it will be. It's clearly an existential problem for the Palestinians, but it's not the problem that has caused conflicts in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Libya, etc. So yes, maybe the conflict is used to recruit some, but I just don't see that as a crucial issue as a result of these most recent activities.
Okay. There is also a fundamental question that some of the, I think, reasoning for stating the winners and the losers was based on the, I think, the assumption that Mr. Trump will win the next election. Now, what if that doesn't happen? Would it change the manner in which you had put the winners and losers in those categories?
Well, ironically, Joe Biden was one of the winners in this deal because the Accords took annexation off the table, and there was clearly going to be a conflict between the Netanyahu government and the Biden campaign, and the Netanyahu government and a future Biden presidency if he were elected, and a conflict between Biden and certain elements of the Jewish community. So I think Biden is probably happy that that issue is off the table now. If Trump, I mentioned that I don't think this is really going to play very heavily in the election. The evangelicals and the right-wing Jewish community will continue to support Trump, and the majority of Jews vote Democrat, and they will likely continue to vote Democrat. So I don't think there's a major change there. If Biden were elected, we might well see an effort. I'm not sure about this, and I haven't heard, but we might well see an effort to revive the agreement with Iran and to try and dial back Iran's nuclear activities, which have increased since the end of the agreement. There will certainly be serious consideration of the sale of these F-35s and other equipment if it seemed to affect Israel's QME, its qualitative edge, military edge, which is actually in US law. There is a US law that requires the US to ensure Israel's qualitative military edge. And if there was a suggestion that that was somehow going to be affected, then I imagine that that Biden and a Democratic Congress might well have some concerns and put a hold on some of those sales. I assume that there would be, over time, not immediately, an effort to try and revive Israeli-Palestinian talks. Of course, we recall the Obama-Kerry efforts in that regard, many other efforts, and Democrats generally are interested in moving that issue forward, generally in a more balanced way than certainly the Trump plan was as conceived.
Thank you. There was something that you mentioned during your opening remarks, and that was that this accord may be perceived as anti-Iran axis in the region. Now, given the historic relationship between Iran and Israel, not until long ago, do you think there are some opportunities for correction of the course vis-a-vis Iran?
Well, you know, there were great relationships between the Shah and Israel. There were, even when I was an ambassador in Israel, excellent relationships between Turkey and Israel. They were considered, along with the United States, one of its most important strategic and trade and economic partners. Those have changed now for a variety of reasons. We know what's happened in Iran, and with Erdogan in Turkey and support for Hamas, we see evidence of the change there. I don't see that these agreements will improve relations with Iran. I think they are, in fact, in part intended to shore up the anti-Iran axis, and Trump wants it, the UAE wants it, the Saudis want it, and certainly Israel wants it. And I think for Bibi Netanyahu, in addition to the legitimacy factor which these accords bring, to have new allies on the Iran front is a real feather in his cap, within Israel especially.
There is one more question. I mean, there are several other questions that were submitted earlier. One of them is about the, again, question of encouraging Palestinians to return to negotiations. In your view, what would be an effective way to encourage them to come back to negotiations?
Well, as I suggested, I think they should begin to be working on that right now. I don't think that the signings of these accords by itself is an encouragement to them by any stretch of the imagination. You know, the Palestinians, there seems to be an argument that, you know, you started out with 45% and then you moved to 22%. And if the Trump plan went through, you were going to get 17% of the territory. So you better take whatever on the table or you're going to have nothing eventually. Well, I don't think that's really a realistic argument in terms of Palestinian self-determination. And I don't think it's a fair argument. And I don't think it's going to resolve this conflict between the two sides. I don't buy that argument. And I will return to my view that that until we get a different government, although I'm not sure that a Gantz Ashkenazi blue and white government would be that much more supportive, I don't know. But we need a new government in Israel, we need a new government in the territories, and we need a new government in the United States that would all be working in the same direction to come up with the compromises necessary for a two-state solution. And I continue to believe that's the only solution, notwithstanding the recent writings of some progressive Jews on the left that have begun arguing for a one-state solution.
So in other words, you don't see any prospects for United Arab Emirates and maybe Bahrain or Oman working together to create some incentives so the Palestinians would be encouraged to come to the table of negotiations?
I think the Palestinians are ready to come to the table for negotiations right now. But they're not prepared to come to the table on the basis of the Trump plan, which essentially puts Jerusalem in the Israeli camp, gives them 17% of what they originally had in terms of land, no military, and no right of return, of course, and not even a symbolic right of return. So yes, I think the Palestinians in some ways have been prepared to come to the table. They have recognized Israel. This is not a question of somehow UAE recognizing Israel where the Palestinians haven't. They have recognized, Abbas has recognized Israel, but they've got to come to the table with some partners that are actually prepared to compromise both sides. So if the UAE and Bahrain can encourage that, that'd be great. Do I think that they're going to push Bibi Netanyahu in that direction? No.
So that makes this very difficult for NGOs or maybe some of the other organizations in Canada or elsewhere to work with the parties involved to bring some sort of a resolution. I mean, resolution probably is too strong, but some sort of agreement for resolving the differences.
They've now got embassies. They soon will have embassies there, and if progressives, let me just step back. The analysis is that the other loser in this is the left in Israel, as if it wasn't already marginalized with the Labour Party almost non-existent and the left having almost disappeared. So they are losers. But to the extent that left political parties and organizations like the New Israel Fund or Peace Now or Peace Now Canada want to advocate, they might well have new allies, and they should be knocking on the doors of those embassies early on to see whether or not the offers to advocate on behalf of Palestine are real and what it is they might be able to do together. It's possible, and I don't think we should discount it. I'm just more skeptical than others at this point.
There is a question which I think you have already answered it, but some are concerned that maybe this agreement and the fact that the Palestinians are out of it would further inflame the extremists, and especially with the Saudis being on the loser side. Do you agree with that kind of a understanding or analysis?
Well, as I said, the only two benefits that came out of this agreement for the Palestinians, one was that they were united in its opposition. They actually, via Zoom or some other method, got together, which they haven't done in a long time, to oppose the agreement. The other positive element of the agreement was that it took de jure legal annexation off the table. Annexation, in some sense, the expansion of settlements is continuing as we are having this conference. So it's not as if by taking a legal annexation off the table, their problems have disappeared, but at least they don't have an annexation which would have required 2/3 of the Knesset to reverse if it had gone forward. Will there be more radicalism? Well, we saw a couple of rockets being fired, not from Hamas, but from one of the other agents in the Gaza. I think that was symbolic. I don't think that this is going to lead to violence at this time. I don't see it necessarily coming from Iran or Turkey at this time. But over time, frustration, etc., could build, and one might see violence. I don't predict it. It's interesting that the so-called Arab street has been quiet throughout. Bahrain has a majority Shiite population, not heard much. There are many in the UAE. Apparently, there was a poll done a month and a half ago, only 20% of the population of the UAE supported this kind of deal. And whether it was the recognition of Jerusalem or the Trump plan or this, the Arab street has not reacted. It's quite understandable that in Bahrain, in the UAE, there wouldn't be much reaction because it would be put down probably with the assistance of some Israeli equipment that's already been delivered quite quickly. But what people predicted, thought might happen, has not happened. And perhaps it's yet another sign that that these countries are operating in their own national interests, their concerns about Iran, their desire to have weapons, their interest in acquiring technology from Israel, etc. And they're not interested in putting those interests aside in support of the Palestinians.
Now, during the overview that you provided regarding the state of Israel and what's going on with respect to the discussions between different parties, some of the charges against Prime Minister are pretty strong. And now you think with this scenario, with this accord, will those things go away?
Well, the legal charges will not go away. And his trial will begin fairly soon, unless, of course, he provokes an election and then wins so significantly that he tries to pass legislation that prevents his trial going forward, etc., provides immunity for a sitting prime minister, etc. So, but this agreement, understandably, is clearly popular amongst Israelis. Those that support Bibi will be extremely happy. The settlers will be unhappy. The settlers who had hoped for annexation will be unhappy, and they may well turn to a different party, Bennett's party perhaps, or others. I can't predict at this point. And those that are unhappy with Bibi about the economy, about his handling or mishandling of the COVID crisis, about his attacks on the judiciary and the rule of law, his self-appointed attorney general, the prosecutors and the police, those people I don't think will significantly change their opinion, but the vast majority of Israelis will be happy with this accord. Some will be happy, period. Some will be happy, but he'll get some benefit from it. Whether he gets a majority, if he calls an election, hard to predict when you set it aside against what's going on in the country on a day-to-day basis.
The other question is, again, based on the assumptions that we made earlier, is what if the sales of those sophisticated weapons or fighter jets to United Arab Emirates is not approved by the Congress?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, my understanding of it is that Congress does not have a veto unless there is a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, because a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate would be enough to override the president's veto. So only if they had that could they actually prevent the sale. That said, they could cause a pretty significant ruckus, and if they were able to provide evidence that Israel's QME, qualitative military edge, was going to be seriously threatened, there may well be a groundswell of support that would make any president hesitate. And if those deals didn't go through, clearly the UAE would not be terribly happy. The other thing that has not happened is that the details of this agreement have not been shared with the Minister of Defense in Israel, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Israel. Benny Gantz, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, has not seen the agreements, nor has Ashkenazi, and they were not privy to the negotiations. They were clearly not privy to the side deal, which is pretty important side deal, the F-35s and other equipment. It's not just F-35s. So the one thing that I understand Gabi Ashkenazi did get out of Bibi, and I won't go into the details, but he got out of him an obligation to bring the agreement before the Knesset for full approval of the Knesset before it goes forward. So there's going to be some questions there. I mean, on the surface, the UAE and Israel have a lot of interests. If there were another war in Gaza, if the Israelis did X, Y, or Z, and there was a rift between the UAE and Bahrain and these other countries, all of a sudden the UAE's got these F-35s and not giving them back. The qualitative military edge is not going to turn back. So there are some serious concerns about this in Israel and perhaps in Congress. And we'll just have to see how it plays out in both those venues.
A number of colleagues who are asking questions are complimenting you for your, again, very professional and even-handed analysis of the situation. So there is a question, again, pertaining to this, not exactly the same issue, but related, and that is, what about some of the posturings in the Middle East right now? And it's pertaining to the desire that everyone now wants to have access to civilian nuclear energy, which could easily be turned into military uses. What are your views on that?
Well, you know, it's really Iran related. And if Iran were to continue to move in the direction of a military nuclear capability, that is what prompts the Saudis and others to want to have the same. They may have an Abraham Accord with Israel, but they're not going to rely on Israel in the end to defend them. And I don't think they can rely on the Americans to defend them. So as long as you've got the potential for an Iranian nuclear capability, you're going to have interests on the part of the Saudis and others in the region to want to have the same. And that's the real danger. And that's why I and many others, including the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and others, supported the JPOA, because while it was far from a perfect agreement, it didn't stop Iranian missile attacks, it didn't stop Iranian support for radicals, it didn't stop Iranians' attitude towards Israel, it did slow significantly and had the potential to stop Iran's development of a military nuclear capability. So, sanctions don't seem to be stopping Iran moving forward, and I don't think most people knowledgeable about the region thought it would. So you've got this new tension, and that new tension combined with tensions between Turkey and Greece in the Mediterranean, and between the conflicts in Yemen and Libya, it's not healthy. It's not a healthy environment for people who are seeking nuclear capabilities.
I think in addition to the posturing of Iran, the fact that we are now still talking about tactical nuclear weapons, I guess that's another probably reason why people in different countries are again looking at the nuclear energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the questions is pertaining to the embassies that you mentioned, that these countries will soon have embassies in Israel. And so far, they haven't announced where it will be. What if it will be in Tel Aviv instead of Urushalim, Jerusalem? Would it make a difference? Would it have an impact on the normalization process with the Palestinians?
Well, it would be an interesting symbolic step if they decided indeed to establish them in Tel Aviv, where the vast majority of embassies continue to be. And I don't know what's in the deal and where the location is. That'll be another very interesting thing to see. If they were in Tel Aviv, yes, I think that would be a sign, a symbol that they had not given up some of the key tenets of the Arab Peace Initiative, which is East Jerusalem capital for the Palestinians, West Jerusalem capital for the Israelis, access to all for the Al-Aqsa, which apparently is included in the agreement. Access for all Muslims, not just within Israel and the occupied territories, but access to all Muslims to Al-Aqsa is allegedly in the agreement, which is important. But yeah, I think that would be a very interesting sign. I would see that as a positive sign. Another interesting element of the opposition to the deal is, of course, Turkey. Turkey established relations with Israel in 1949 and has maintained those relations and an embassy throughout. They've withdrawn their ambassador a couple of times, but they've maintained that. And yet, when the UAE signs a recognition deal, they criticize the UAE for recognizing Israel and establishing relations, and the same for Bahrain. So there's a little bit of an irony there.
And in regards to the international context of this accord, I haven't heard much from UN or from the European Union or other organizations. Have you heard anything?
That's interesting. Tony Blair had an article in Haaretz in which he praised the agreement. He's no longer the head of the quartet or anything, but a former head of the quartet and prime minister. The European ambassadors apparently did not attend the White House ceremony. The ambassadors from Oman did, and Sudan, but the Europeans did not. As we were commenting before we came on air, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada recently issued a statement in support of the agreement and praising it and hoping for peace in the region. And our fairly newly minted ambassador in the UAE, Marcy Grossman, also tweeted support for peace in the region. and there was no mention of the Palestinian issue in these. It was a full-throated support for it. But I have not seen a statement by the United Nations. I have not seen a statement by any of the European leaders up until now. And that will be interesting to see as well.
Yeah. One of the other questions is pertaining to the element of arms race, because we are talking about the sales of F-35 to United Arab Emirates, and potentially others would probably like to have the same thing or maybe something more sophisticated. So aren't we indirectly encouraging sort of an arms race in the region?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what Donald Trump wants to do, because he wants everybody to come to the United States and buy those arms. You'll recall that when Jamal Khashoggi was horribly assassinated in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, Donald Trump refused to accept the analysis either from the CIA or from the special rapporteur of the UN that it was not only the Saudis involved, but it was likely MBS who had ordered it. He basically said that he wasn't interested in any way prejudicing the millions, billions of dollars of sales of weapons that had been allegedly negotiated with the Saudis. So there were those that questioned whether or not those deals had been actually inked and how far they had progressed, but nonetheless, his interest was far more in the sales of arms than it was in human rights issues in the kingdom. So yes, arms race, no question. I mean, you thank the various countries who've recognized Israel by providing them with arms, and then Israel needs more arms, as they got when they signed deals with Jordan and Egypt, to ensure that they will have their qualitative military edge. So you get a general buildup. And it's not just arms, it's pretty sophisticated technology that frankly will be used in Saudi Arabia and in the other Gulf states to ensure that democracy does not see the light of day in the near future.
One of the other questions pertaining to the earlier comments about the state of affairs in Israel, to what extent Knesset should be involved in this agreement? Do they have to ratify it, or is it null and void if they don't ratify it?
Well, as I said, Bibi got a requirement, a demand from Ashkenazi. You see what, I'll just briefly say what happened. The Attorney General decreed that Bibi did not have the power to sign those agreements without prior consent from the foreign ministry. And so at the last minute, Bibi had to get consent from Gabi Ashkenazi. In return for the consent, for that consent, Ashkenazi demanded that the Knesset would have to approve the agreement. So yes, my understanding, and of course Bibi can, try and get around the commitment and the obligation. Who knows what will happen? But my understanding is that now the Knesset does have to approve it. I am assuming the Knesset will approve it. They may have comments, they may have concerns, but I'd be very strange. I don't know whether they can put conditions on it in terms of QME or other elements, but it'd be very strange to me if the Knesset didn't approve this agreement. It is too important for Israel on so many levels.
Okay. there is one question pertaining to what we discussed earlier regarding the access to religious areas. Now, the question is that although there was a discussion about access to Al-Aqsa and so on, but what if some of the Orthodox groups want to have access to the same sites? Would that again cause conflicts and uprisings? What do you think?
I don't imagine that these agreements spoke about access of the Orthodox to the Temple Mount / Al-Aqsa. I'm sure they didn't. And as we know, access by Arik Sharon, access by radical Orthodox groups have caused problems in the past. And I would sincerely hope that people would not use this agreement or any other reason to generate that kind of polarization and stirring up of the pot. This really should be the beginning of a broader peace between these countries and Israel, and we wouldn't want it somehow to be abused or misused in order to inflame the situation. It's already tense enough as it is.
Thank you so much, John. And now we are almost at the end of our session, but I wanted to invite you to provide some sort of a closing remark. Again, as a nonpartisan senior diplomat, what are your suggestions if we are going to really make this to be a message for peace, the Abraham Accord? Talking about the losers, how can we bring the losers around and really make this to happen as a very peaceful moment for all of us in the, not only in the region, but us in Canada, US, and elsewhere to celebrate this?
Well, it would be great if these agreements did indeed signal a new opening towards Israel and towards the Gulf, and I'm hopeful that they might in the medium term. I will go back to what I said though about the Palestinians. This issue's not dealt with in these accords. It will not go away. It is a monkey on Israel's back and will continue to be, because it involves the occupation of a people who seek self-determination, and it can't go on forever. So what I want to happen is I want the Palestinians to grab a hold of the situation and say, we're going to take our destiny into our own hands. We're going to work with these Gulf states. We're going to work with hopefully a new administration in the US. And we're going to come up with a compromise set of proposals that we're going to put to the Israeli people, to the Israeli government, and to our friends in Europe, etc., and offer to work with that. Make it clear to the world that they too have and continue to recognize Israel's existence, but they also believe in their own self-determination. So if we can see that come out of this, if this can be a harbinger for a greater peace, then I think it will be a great thing. I wouldn't give Donald Trump the Nobel Peace Prize for it, but I think it would be a great ending to what is just the beginning. This is really just a beginning in many ways.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John. And I would suggest to everyone to go to different material which is available on the website. There are a number of articles and number of commentaries regarding this accord. And I think what you have presented here is based on your several years of experience in the Middle East and also as a senior fellow at the University of Toronto and also Canadian International Council. So I respect your knowledge, and your even-handed analysis of the situation was very useful. As I said, a number of participants have sent praises for what you have said, and on behalf of the group, the Middle East Study Group and CIC, I would like to thank you for giving us your perspectives, and this was a tremendous pleasure for me to have this chat with you, and I look forward to other sessions that we can have in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and I again thank all the participants for giving us an opportunity to reach out to you, and especially Sam, who has been diligently listening to everything we have been saying and also helping us with the technical aspects of this presentation. So thank you all, and let's hope for peace. Shalom.
Peace. Shalom. Salam. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just for all attendees who are still on this webinar, there is a playback on YouTube. If you go to CIC-Ottawa on YouTube, I will also share the link in the chat. Just bear with me a few moments, but thank you very much all for attending, and I hope you have a pleasant day.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Hamid.
My pleasure.
Be well.
Okay.